Okay, so in chapter 1, they talk about research strategies and experimental design and independent variables, dependent variables, that kind of stuff. And that can get pretty complicated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it and see if I can't clarify some of the concepts in there. So this is my research strategies lecture. So science is a precise way of knowing. We have introspection we have feelings, but science attempts to be very quantitative in how it answers questions, okay? And how do we do that? Well, there are two different types of methods in psychology. One is systematic observation and the other is experimentation. While experimentation is probably the most concise, it also can suggest cause and effect. Systematic observation is necessary because a lot of experimentation cannot ethically be done in humans and higher primates and stuff like that. So we use systematic observation to address questions when we want to use humans as subjects, okay? So first we're going to talk a little bit about what a theory is. Theory is an idea that you have about something, okay? It's a way to organize your thinking about a problem, to summarize your idea of how something works and simplify it, all right? Because psychology can have very broad, huge ideas, and you have to kind of bring them down, minimalize them, so you can start to ask a really specific question and get a really specific answer. So, like I said, theory is a way to organize knowledge and it can predict stuff. So, for instance, you could have a scientist or a clinician who has a lot of patients who suffer from depression, okay? And maybe they see all these patients who have depression and they notice over time that a lot of their patients that have depression have really low self-esteem. So they come up with this theory that somehow levels of self-esteem are related to levels of depression. So that's a really general idea, but it's kind of bringing together or connecting two ideas, okay? So the theory might begin to predict too. It would say your theory about depression and self-esteem, well, it might work something like this. Well, it seems to me that people who have really high levels of depression have very low levels of self-esteem. So one could begin to predict that patients, therefore, whose self-esteem can be raised somehow, might show less symptoms of depression. You see how that predicts? It predicts that the direction of self-esteem, whether high or low, would result in the direction or the high or low of depressive symptoms. So there you've got a direct predictive relationship. And that's another reason why theories are really good. They're making a very specific prediction. There are several different types of theories that are used in psychology. These are just like 5 of them, but there are actually many, many more. Okay. These are the big ones, though, and they are all applicable to developmental psychology in one way or another. As we read through the material, especially in chapter 2, actually, they go over in quite some detail epigenetic, sociocultural. They do go over humanism, cognitive behaviorism, and psychoanalytic. And each one of these types of theoretical frameworks are quite different from one another. And it's really helpful when you look at some aspect of development to have people approaching these ideas or these phenomenon from many different frameworks. It gives you a really big picture or a much more concise picture of what's actually going on in the various stages of development. Okay. So when someone forms a hypothesis, they're devising a very testable question that predicts what the outcome will be. So a hypothesis creates a testable question that has predictive validity. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean, for instance, let's go back to the self-esteem and depression example, that's probably best. So a way that that clinician could test that theory about self-esteem and depression would be to set up an experiment where you would give several patients a survey looking at self-esteem, and then you would give them a separate survey that looked at their depressive symptoms. And the hypothesis of that particular researcher might be that patients who exhibit high levels of depressive symptoms have very low self-esteem. Or alternatively, it could be that those with very high self-esteem have almost no symptomology of depression. So that's very testable, right? We used a survey in a population of patients, and we did a correlational evaluation of those surveys to see if there was a relationship between self-esteem and depression. Okay, and it was very predictive. So this is a flow chart of how the scientific method works. I'm not really going to test you on this at all. It just kind of gives you an idea. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. But in psychology, like I said, there are several different types of ways of answering questions. This is an example. What I have here is an example of a true experiment I did. So this isn't an observational study. It's not a survey. It's not a case study. Okay, it's not naturalistic. This is an experiment, a true experiment. And for this experiment, we had this theory that there were certain proteins in an area of the brain called the hippocampus that played a really important role in memory. Okay? And our hypothesis was that if we increase the amount of this protein in the hippocampus of the brain, we should be able to enhance memory. So there is my prediction, right? My direct prediction that increasing levels of this protein in the hippocampus would enhance memory. Okay, so we set up the experiment. This particular experiment was done in rodents, in mice, and basically there was a drug that was developed, and it was thought that this drug would increase this really important protein that we call CREB in the hippocampus of brains. Okay, so some of the mice got this cool drug that we thought would enhance memory, and some mice didn't. Okay, this is called the independent variable in an experiment. It's the presence or absence of some variable. Okay, it's the thing that the researcher manipulates, and in this case, the manipulation was drug versus no drug. The dependent variable is the thing you measure. The dependent variable is also dependent on the independent variable. Okay? So the dependent variable in this case is memory, and we had a special task. It's called the Morse water maze, and it's kind of like a puzzle that the animal solves, and they develop memory for this puzzle over time. Okay? So we use this Morse water maze as an indicator that the animal still had memory. So the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. Memory was dependent on the drug, okay? And the mice were randomly assigned to either a control group or an experimental group, okay? So a control group is a mouse that does not receive the drug, and the experimental group is the mice that did receive the drug. You've got to have a control group, because without a control group, you have nothing to compare your drug group to. I mean, basically the results would be absolutely meaningless because you can't compare it to anything. Okay. Now, sometimes instead of a mouse receiving no drug as the control group, a mouse might receive something as a placebo, or what's called a placebo. And I'm sure you've all heard of that term before. It's like a sugar pill. So let's say I had patients who had migraines, and I had a drug that I thought would make the migraines go away. Well, some of my patients, and of course none of them would know that they received the drug or not, but some of my patients would receive the drug, and some of my patients would receive a sugar pill. And the sugar pill makes it so that everybody thinks that they got the drug, even though they didn't all get the drug, right? And you can compare the drug group to that sugar group later on when you look at the results of your experiment. Now, the reason why this is an experiment is we can say without a doubt that if memory is enhanced in these mice, that the drug caused the memory enhancement. In other types of studies, like observational studies, correlational studies, case studies, we can't definitively say cause and effect. And that's what makes experiments really, really good. Okay. So that's what experiments are. That's number 3. There are other types of studies, and these studies are under the term descriptive research. And these include case studies, natural observation, survey research, and then correlation is kind of another study. So what's a case study or a descriptive study? All right, a case study is a study about a single individual. Okay, and here's an example of a little girl. Her name was Jeannie, and she was abused when she was very, very young. This happened in Los Angeles around 1970s, and basically her parents locked her in a basement from pretty much the moment that she was born up until she was age 13. It was a really sad situation because there were no toys down there, there was no TV, there was no, that she had no human contact. Her parents didn't even really speak to her, so she wasn't exposed to any language. She wasn't exposed to any kind of stimulus that a normal child really should be. And somebody found out about it, reported to the police when she was like 13, so officials finally found her when she was 13. And so you've got this really horrible, horrible situation. You've got this kid that was seriously abused for the first 13 of years of her life, but it's not something you would ever replicate in another person, right? It's totally unethical. But a lot of developmental psychologists were interested in the case because you've got this really rare situation and they could ask questions about it. And one of the questions that they asked was about language acquisition. And the question was, do you absolutely have to be exposed to language when you're a little kid in order to speak that language later on? Or can you actually learn language just as well later on, okay? And basically what they found was that little kids learn language super well when they're very young because their brains are so plastic. But it's not absolutely necessary. So though Jeannie was never exposed to language, she was taught language at age 13, and she pretty much learned it really, efficiently and very quickly at that age. There were certain little problems about her grammar, certain nuances of grammar that she never quite got, but for the most part, she was able to acquire language. So this answered a really interesting question about language acquisition in a very unique case. Here's an example of naturalistic observation. It's used a lot with children because it's pretty unethical to manipulate children in numerous ways, right? Nobody wants their kids put into some odd behavioral study. So naturalistic observation is where here's an example, or here's a picture of actually Jane Goodall and her apes and chimpanzees that she studied. Basically, you go into the environment and you just write down and observe everything you see. So if you have a certain question about behavior, you can go in there with that question and you can try to see if the behavior is being displayed by the children or not in different conditions. Unfortunately, a lot of times the behavior of interest, you may be going in there thinking, okay, I'm going to look at these kids and I'm going to watch them behaving in this situation and that situation and write down what I see because I have this hypothesis. But unfortunately, a lot of times the children won't even exhibit the behavior that you're interested in. So naturalistic observation can be really tricky. Another problem is that you can't really control things in naturalistic observation. So you have kids coming from all different backgrounds. Maybe they have different ages, different genders, different like family environments, just so many differences among the children that even though you're seeing the behavior and you think the behavior is associated with whatever variable, you can't with 100% surety say what's causing it. You can only suggest, okay? So that's another limitation of naturalistic observation. Okay, surveys is another type of descriptive method. So if you go back to that question of depression and self-esteem, you would give those patients a survey, which is a self-report on how they feel. All right, so it's usually designed using a Likert scale. So you guys have done this when you've done surveys about teachers and how much you like them or didn't like them. Usually it'll be on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being that you couldn't stand them, 5 was that you really liked them, and 3 was like neutral, and you fill in the dot along that Likert scale. Well, that's how a lot of these surveys work. So like 1 would be I feel totally depressed all the time, and 5 might be I'm never depressed at all, and 3 is kind of neutral. A lot of times when people do a survey where they self-report, their responses can be really biased, and these biases can be due to their mood that day, or maybe how they feel about the experimenter giving out the survey. Sometimes people want to try and give the experimenter the answer that they think that the experimenter is looking for. Sometimes they actually want to screw up the experiment for some reason. There are a lot of reasons why self-survey don't work. One of the most prevalent reasons is it's really hard for us to report on how we're feeling. I mean, think about it. Can you tell me right now, from a scale from 1 to 5, how happy you feel? If you're tired, that's going to affect it. If something bad happened this morning, that's going to affect it. Whereas maybe on a regular basis, you're not depressed or you're usually feeling happy. It's just so many things can confound the results of a survey. Okay, so those are the different kinds of studies that they talk about in your textbook. We went over an experiment. We went over surveys, naturalistic observation, case studies. I tried to explain what an independent variable is versus dependent variable. I'm going to be putting all these PowerPoints on the Blackboard, so not just the lecture itself, but the full my full PowerPoints for this topic that might be helpful. Please email me if you have any more questions about this. I hope that helped.